thank you all for being here this morning, and good morning to you. Today I have the pleasure of introducing a dear friend, and she is passionate about everything she does. And whether it's her personal life, her professional life, or her spiritual life, she has so much passion about her, and she has used the beautiful gifts that God has given her in her life, and He has blessed her with, to experience exciting and faith-building adventures and studies in her field. Rebekah Dutton was born in Huntsville, Alabama, to Rick and Peggy Reeder, and she attended Athens Bible School for 13 years, graduating in 2004, and in 2007 she married her best friend, Trent Dutton. She began working as a technical writer and editor during college and received her undergraduate degree in technical communications and Spanish language from the University of Alabama in Huntsville in 2008. In 2012, while considering new career paths in historical studies, they experienced Israel for the first time on a tour with Farrell and Elizabeth Jenkins. Enamored with the research being conducted there, Rebekah and Trent decided to pursue graduate studies, and those studies being in Near Eastern archaeology. Rebekah graduated from Wheaton College with a master's in ancient Near Eastern archaeology in 2015, specializing in the study of animal domestication and trade. Trent followed suit in 2016. They have worked together excavating, studying, and traveling in Israel and Jordan, growing to love the land and its people. Together, she and Trent also contribute to the monthly archaeology column for the Truth magazine. Currently, Rebekah works as an archaeologist for a cultural resource management firm and teaches women's classes at Eastside Church of Christ. However, she most enjoys her work as a stay-at-home mother for their daughter Abigail. Let's welcome Rebekah as she talks with us about helping skeptics come to faith. Thank you for being here.
All right, so Carrie's going to make me tear up just a little bit. All right, so as Carrie said, I am very excited to be here. I'm very excited to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. People that I've known growing up, people from Eastside Church of Christ, and very good friends as far north as Illinois have come to join us. So as we begin today, I want to open with a thought experiment. And so I want you to take a moment and just think to yourself, if you did not believe that the Bible was divinely inspired, if you did not believe that God existed at all, what kind of evidence would you require to convince you? And I want you to just take a moment and mull that over in your mind. Strip away who you are currently, strip away your beliefs, and put yourself in the skeptic's shoes. And as you take that moment, I want you to ask that question, but I want you to be honest with yourself. Because if your answer is, I just know it in my heart, or because of this passage in this scripture that tells me that God is, no, that's not the game. Because the game is you don't believe. And so what this study is about today is we are going to begin by clarifying what the goal of our discussion is, before we're going to then go ahead and define who is a skeptic, what is skepticism. And then we're going to also look at the context, the psychology around skepticism. After that, we are going to cover some methods of engagement, talk a little bit about rhetoric, things that will aid us on that journey. But then the remainder of our time, we are going to examine ways that science, archaeology, We'll talk briefly about the internal text, as well as philosophy, can all serve as vital tools as we approach the skeptic and as we try to persuade them of God's existence and the Bible's truth. And I do want to note that these topics aren't the only ones, or the only sources of contention for people who question God or who question the Bible. But what they're going to help us with is they're going to help us create a framework for then building on that structure to bring in the internal text. And so as you go on out of this discussion, then you may want to look at things like textual criticism or the transmission of the Bible over time. And what I also want to note is that this discussion today, we are going to focus heavily on extra biblical material. But we are not dismissing the text, and we're not dismissing God from the conversation, because the time will come in your discussion with a skeptic that the defendant is going to speak for himself. And the persuasive of the power of the Bible can then be brought into play. And so today's discussion is how to help the skeptic come to the table, to open the Bible with you and begin that discussion. All right. So first off, who are they? The skeptic. And when we talk about a skeptic, we are generally defining that term as broadly an individual who questions a belief. And I really like that broad definition, because what that allows us to do is it allows us to loop in a Christian who's beginning to question their faith, maybe having a faith crisis, but it can take us all the way to a Richard Dawkins, and we can include everybody in our conversation then. But we're going to talk about 4 major schools of skeptical thought, and we understand these are all on a spectrum. There are people that fall in between, hybrids of these different categories, but it's useful to understand these, because once you can identify your skeptic's worldview, you can better understand where they are coming from. And then, like Paul, you begin to understand how to loop their worldview into your conversation. And so we start with agnosticism. And an agnostic is going to be an individual who holds that one cannot know or believe a proposition to be true without what they define as logically satisfactory evidence. And yes, that is an extremely subjective definition. And so any agnostic may have different levels of what to them is logically satisfactory. But an agnostic then may acknowledge the possibility of God's existence, but they are going to hold that they cannot know for certain that God does exist. Next up, we have a religious atheist. And we use that term because broadly the term religion means that you have an objective value of life, and you acknowledge that the universe, the natural world, is sublime. And so religious atheists are people who still believe that you must live good, ethical lives, that there is a purpose in life, and they are in awe of the natural world. So we have examples like Albert Einstein was a religious atheist. More recently, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson are religious atheists. Next up, we have the materialist or the naturalist. And these are going to be individuals that believe that there must be a natural and a scientific explanation for all phenomena in the universe. And that means and concludes that there cannot be a supernatural explanation. There cannot be a supernatural being. So anything that seems miraculous, anything that seems supernatural, we just haven't developed the scientific tools to measure it yet. The last one we want to talk about is the nihilist. And when we are looking at this broad spectrum, these folks are at the very dark end. So the nihilist says that all values are baseless. No truth can be known. And even if there were truth, it's not going to be objective truth. So we believe then that life has no purpose, existence has no purpose. We are just holding on those tiny, hopeless little specks in the universe. world. So we've given you all these definitions of broad categories. But when you're talking to your skeptic, remember they have a name. They are not just the agnostic, the nihilist. They are going to be someone usually close to you. You're going to have some kind of emotional or professional tie. When you think about that, and when you think about approaching these people, one of the first things to remind yourself is that you are accountable for your effort. God is not holding you accountable for your success. He has provided the evidence. He has provided you with it as a vessel to deliver that evidence, but that's all you can do. So take heart if you begin to feel discouraged. Just know that you're doing your best. You are playing out your divine role. All right, let's talk about why are they the way they are. So again, these people have names. They're not, again, just the agnostic, the materialist. They are Mrs. Jones or Robert from down the road. But when you are encountering someone whose beliefs differ from your own, we have the golden rule. So you are beginning with empathy. You are putting yourself in their shoes. And that's because one of the reasons a person is a skeptic can be extremely complex. And we're going to talk about those reasons here in a second. But one of the first things that you do is you ask yourself, how would I feel to hear someone treat God or heaven or the Bible? How do I want to hear people speak of my beliefs? Because we think of how we want to hear our beliefs spoken of, and we need to give that same respect, that same care of language to their beliefs. And so what we need to do, let's see if this works. Yeah. All right, it's a little offset, but that's cool. Because one of the first things to remember is that we need to go into this conversation assuming that we are the only example of Christianity that this person is ever going to encounter. It might not be true, but we need to go in with that hypothetical assumption. And so that we can kind of better measure the depth and care of our approach, then I want to talk about some of the contexts that may cause a person to believe, and we'll use that broadly, in agnosticism or in atheism. And first off, they may have been raised that way. So just as many of you, I'm sure, were born in the pew, many of you were converted at different points. Some people are raised as skeptics. We had that fad where parents are raising their children not talking about religion so that their child can organically develop their own beliefs. You're going to raise a skeptic. And so it could be cultural, it could be their home life. One thing to remind us of is that the skeptic may not necessarily be an atheist. It could be someone who simply does not believe in the Judeo-Christian God. So one of the challenges then with a nurtured skeptic is that when you are approaching them, when you are trying to change their mind, remember that you are challenging their identity. You are pushing them to change everything about them. You're pushing them to say, Mom and Dad were wrong, or the government was wrong, or my rabbi, or my yogi master, whoever. So you're treading on very tender ground there. Next up, they may just genuinely believe, based on the evidence at hand, that there is no God, or that the Bible is not true. And so this kind of gets us back to our agnostics or our materialists. And so the challenge with these individuals is because they've convinced themselves, and because the evidence that they have at hand has convinced them, you're going to have to overcome that pride to encourage them to re-examine, to revisit their own views, what they have adopted themselves. The last couple then start getting into more careful territory. And the first one then we're going to talk about is people who have been hurt or mistreated or offended by Christians. And these people have determined then that whatever that person is, I'm going to be the opposite. because they're a terrible person. And we know Christians like that. We know Christians who have difficulties overcoming bluntness or frankness in the wrong context. And so going back to assuming that you're the only Christian they're going to meet, your job with these kind of skeptics is to prove to them that their encounter was an anomaly, that Christians are not like that. And the last one then is going to be someone who is coping with trauma. So someone who has suffered a loss, terminal illnesses, it could be anything. And in coping then, they have reasoned that there cannot be a God, because a loving God would not let this thing have happened. And so we understand that that's a flawed view of a loving God. And so with a skeptic like this, that's your job, is to help them understand that God does love, God does provide means of hope and coping. And it's rather flawed humanity that creates the terrible situations we encounter. So these are why a skeptic may be the way they are. Now let's talk about where we find them, which is everywhere. One of the things, they may be on social media. We love finding them on social media, right? You'll see them on message boards. They can be in our schools, our universities, our government, our media. They could be on the bus with you, in the next cubicle. They may be sitting next to you in the same pew. They may be sitting at your dinner table. And so we say this because we never want to denigrate a skeptic, and we never want to denigrate skepticism. We don't want to mock atheism. We don't want to crack jokes. Because when we are cruel and facetious, even if we think that we are among like-thinking individuals, we can't know what's going on in someone's mind. And so you may shut down questions that your child may have. You may have offended your neighbor so badly that they're not going to ask you for your answers, for your hope. And we remember then that Jesus and his apostles never used belittling language when they spoke of the unbelievers in the world. Now, Paul did kind of make fun of, the Cretans, but they were also fellow Christians. But they write in Colossians 4:5-6 to walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of time, to let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer each person. So again, remembering the golden rule. Now, that brings us then in how to open the dialogue with our skeptics. And so when we want to open the dialogue, we are talking about what we would call our rhetorical approach. And when we use that term rhetoric, rhetoric is simply defined as the art of persuasion. It's just a really cool word, especially if you're playing Wordle, to throw something like that in there. But in order to persuade the skeptic, then you have to be equipped both with the knowledge as well as the skill necessary to bring this discussion to the table. And one of the best examples we can look to in the scripture is Paul. Paul speaks throughout the ancient Near East. He's talking to people in Jerusalem. He's going as far as Rome. We talk about the fact that he even went as far as Tarshish, which is likely in Spain. So this is a man who has traveled throughout the Mediterranean world. And so he is encountering pagans of all shapes and sizes. So not just our classic Greeks or classic Romans, but he's encountering Celts and Phoenicians. And he is delivering the word to all of them. But we look, two of our examples that we see is the difference between Acts 13 and Acts 17. So in Acts 13, he is addressing the Jews. And where does he start with the Jews? Well, he starts with the Exodus. He begins with God's promises. And he builds on that promise then to say, now look, the seed has come. But where does he begin with the Athenians? With the Athenians, he opens with, I see your rituals. I see your religion. I see this altar that you have over here to the God that you do not know. And I'm going to tell you about him. And we even see that Paul quotes back their own poets to them. So he's using their own philosophies, their own literary works to bring the discussion to them. And so what we see with Paul is he starts where his audience is and not where he thinks they ought to be. And we can say, well, Paul had the benefit of a very extensive early education. Paul was inspired by the Holy Spirit, and that's true. We may not have extensive academic backgrounds. We may not be inspired by the Holy Spirit, but we can still educate ourselves. At the same time, when you're preparing to engage in a theological dialogue, this is a great time to revisit your own beliefs. And when we say that, we mean that this is a time to begin winnowing out tradition from truth, because you don't want to bring tradition to the table with a skeptic. Many of the things that atheists, that skeptics hold in a special disdain are not the truth. They are not biblical truths. They don't come from the Bible, and God never said them. But these are traditions and human dogmas that we have overlaid with the biblical text. So some of the issues are simple. It's just that we are 21st century Westerners, and we could not be further removed linguistically, temporally, spatially, anything from the ancient Near East and the context of the biblical message. But other times we just simply need to reread. We need to read closer. And so this especially goes for things like the Catholic myths and traditions that surround particular stories like the Nativity. Because again, when we are looping tradition into the message, our skeptics are going to do research. And if they do research and they see that we're wrong, that we are just pulling things out of the human hat, that's going to affect our credibility. And the other twofold purpose of this is that as a Christian, this will enrich your study of the Bible. It will bring the Bible into more living color, to see it as it is. The last thing that we want to do is talk about answering the hard questions. So when we take the above into account, taking into account the winnowing out of traditions, one of the things that to be aware of is that our skeptic is going to be asking us questions too. And it is very easy for both a skeptic as well as yourself to begin zeroing in the weeds and looking at tricky details and high context topics in the Bible. When you allow yourself to debate a tangent, when you allow yourself to get dragged down into the weeds on a topic that has nothing to do with salvation or the existence of God, what you're doing is you are distracting from the primary issue. You're letting your skeptic deflect. And that means that they don't have to think introspectively about themselves and their convictions, because they can just push you into a corner instead. So we don't want to give them fuel for their argument. And many of their claims and criticisms that they are going to give are mired in ambiguity. They are mired in traditions and misunderstandings. And one of the great examples that we see of this, we call the Sadducees Error. So if you recall, in Matthew 22, the Sadducees come to Jesus with a gotcha question. So who is this woman going to be married to in the resurrection? And if you recall Jesus' response, he shames these people. He shames the Sadducees, because this gotcha question was conceived in an erroneous premise based on a misunderstanding of a concept they held in contempt. So they didn't even believe what they were trying to argue. Now, in the sections where we talk about science or archaeology, we are going to address some of the more common, we would call them difficult questions, or straw man questions that a skeptic may ask. And again, that's not to provide fuel for your argument, but it's so that you're not ambushed if you hear those questions. Now, you may also encounter theological questions from your skeptic about conflicts between Christianity and popular social doctrines. these questions are going to be deeply emotional for both you and the person that you're speaking to, because these are going to challenge long-held convictions, political beliefs. So when that happens, remember that a harsh answer is going to shut down the conversation. But also be aware that these issues, again, are popular straw man arguments. And when I use that term, I'm talking about an argument that can be distorted to make the person arguing it look foolish, or it can be easily knocked down. And so when you are answering these questions, when you are encountering things about social doctrines, be confident. Don't let an unbeliever define what you believe. So we understand that Christianity is not a religion of hate. We know that we're not racist, we're not phobic, we're not sexist, we're not hateful, and we are not followers of such a God. So bringing that in, we can talk about how I start that conversation. And one of the things that we run into, especially when we're looking at apologetics curriculum, is it's extremely optimistic about how that dialogue is going to go, because a rational individual is going to see our logic. If it only were so. Your skeptic is a rational individual. They are an honest individual. They are coming, hopefully, honestly into this conversation. But remember, again, they have a lot to lose by giving up their beliefs. And so one of the best ways to start this conversation is just to live your questionable life. Live your life in such a way that someone who is watching you, whether it's a coworker or a cousin, sees your behavior and starts to wonder, why is this person so loving? When everything terrible is going on in the world, how can they still be happy? How could they treat this person with so much respect, even though this person is, horrible? And it's also important to remember that when you are opening this conversation, this dialogue, this level of conversation and openness and trust that is necessary is probably going to require some kind of bond between you and your skeptic. So you are more likely to convince a family member or a friend or a neighbor than you are someone on the internet or one of your coworkers. And when we talk about coworkers, I do want to throw in the caveat that many workplace rules could consider evangelizing in the office as creating a hostile work environment. Not saying don't evangelize your coworkers, but you may want to invite someone out for coffee before you have a conversation about certain topics in Christianity. But summarizing this section, do your homework, know your skeptic. If you are preparing to engage, write hypothetical dialogues. Just sit there and write a script. Rehearse it in the car, rehearse it in the shower, because everyone's best ideas come to them in the shower, right? If you feel out of your depth or you feel uncertain, ask for help. It's okay. Paul and Barnabas worked together. So don't be afraid to reach out to other Christians to ask questions. Ask people to accompany you. If the situation calls for it, turn your skeptic over to another Christian. It's okay. Paul planted and Apollos watered. That's just how Christianity works. We're teams. And again, just remember that your job is to provide the logical basis. Because once you have built that framework, then you can ask, if the divine is possible, what is that entity's identity? And if that identity is God, then what does God want? And the way that we want to find out how God knows is, how do we know that the Bible represents his will? And so that's what we're going to talk about then as we get into the topic of Christian apologetics. And when we talk about apologetics, then we are defining that broadly as the concept of answering a question. So for Christians then, apologetics is providing a reasoned and intellectual response to questions concerning our faith. And a couple of things just to stress as we are talking about apologetics is to be circumspect as we are approaching the Bible to pull apologetic truths from it. Because oftentimes Christians very justifiably want to find Easter eggs in the Bible. And when I use that term Easter egg, I'm talking about hidden insights into science or into archaeology or what have you that are not going to be discovered by humanity for hundreds or thousands of years. The problem there is that I don't know of a single instance where that is true. When we look at the language, when we look at the context of the scripture, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a blow to Christianity. All it means is that the Bible was set and written in the ancient world, and it uses ancient terms and ancient explanations. And so one biblical scholar, John Walton, very aptly phrases it as the Bible is written for us, but not to us. And all that means is we are not the original Hebrews and Gentiles that the Bible was directed towards. So that means that we can understand the Bible. God has written all things, that which is perfect is come. We have scholars who specialize in Hebrew and Greek. They can translate the nitty-gritty if we need it. But it also means that there are aspects that God did not intend 21st Westerners to understand. And that's okay. You know, what's the behemoth? Who knows? But what that means then, and we have other examples in the New Testament, what was the Corinthians letter about? We always see Paul's side of the discussion. God didn't think that we needed the original letter of the Corinthians to Paul so that we could see their side of the argument. The other problem then is that scientific facts, things that we believe to be scientific fact today, is an absolute moving goalpost. What we know to be proven represents only the limits of human experience and human technology. So remember, the Catholic Church tried to set Galileo on fire because Galileo said that heliocentrism didn't contradict the biblical message. Well, now we look back at it and we're like, haha, they thought that the universe, the solar system revolved around the earth. They didn't think it was that funny. But we say that to say then is that when we weave current scientific theories into our theology, into the foundation of our beliefs, we are beginning to set ourselves up for a spiritual disaster. And we'll talk about that more a little bit when we get into science and things like the age of the earth and evolution. But again, watching for that. And that leads us then into, let's see, knowing our sources, into our topic of science. So, when we are discussing our faith with a true skeptic, one of your first challenges then is to argue that the divine exists. All right, here's our foundation. Does God exist? Does any supernatural entity exist? And the easiest way to do that then is to begin with what can be observed. And so that is the laws of physics, those the particles, those are the biological systems that make up our natural world. And one of the reasons that we need to start there is because we live in the latter days. So there is no more revelation to us. God does not speak to us anymore. And so therefore, we as humans no longer have quantitative evidence that God exists. Quantitative, not qualitative. So there is no experiment that you can perform to say, here's God, right over here. And that's okay. God intended it that way. If he didn't, he would give us quantitative evidence. But what we can do with science is use it then to illustrate a divine presence, illustrate the necessity for intelligent design. And so we talk then about some of the frameworks that people may use to discuss theology as well as understanding science and scientific theory today. And we're back to our naturalist. And again, the naturalist believes that if you can't perform a scientific experiment and observe it, then it doesn't exist. So there is no place for the supernatural again. The next one is interesting, and this is the idea of deism. And deism says that a divine entity exists, and that entity kicked creation in motion. Maybe that entity started the Big Bang. Maybe it started the cosmic egg that turned into the Big Bang. But either way, once creation began, that deity stepped back. And that deity had no intention for its creation, no foresight into what its creation was doing. It's just one and done. That is useful for people who want to, again, intermingle some of their theology with science. And we'll talk about that a little more later. But a closely related concept then is the Bookmark God, or the God of the gaps. And this just says that the unexplained is divine. So we're not naturalists. But if scientific theories haven't proven a phenomenon, described it, well, maybe that could be God. It's called the Bookmark God because think of a bookmark. As you're going through a book, you're advancing it until you get closer and closer to the end, and then you don't need that bookmark anymore. And that's the same thing, is that as scientific discoveries advance, well, we move God further and further down the scale until eventually maybe we don't need God at all because everything's already been explained. And then the last one is the Watchmaker Theory. And sometimes you'll hear this called divine inference pattern. It's cute. But the Watchmaker Theory, I believe probably many of us have heard that, this allegory that as you're walking out in the field, you find a watch in the middle of the field. And you have to ask, how did that watch get there? Did the statistical long lengths of time happen? And as nature was turning, these metals and gears and elements just randomly formed this beautiful watch in the middle of the field? Or do you reason somebody made that? There was the hand of an artisan, the hand of an engineer in developing this object here. And so that's where the Watchmaker Theory comes in, is that as we look at the universe, the cosmos, we say these things are intention shaped. They are designed like. And so for a Christian then, with the Watchmaker Theory, we recognize the hand of an artisan in the creation of the universe. And we also understand then that that entity has the intelligence to operate with intention and with foresight. And that concept of intention and foresight are about to be important as we talk about evolutionary theory. All right. So let's talk about the universe briefly. So again, in their hearts, a lot of our skeptics are religious. And again, going back to that broad definition of religion, that they think that the cosmos are sublime. It's amazing, it's breathtaking. And so with them though, what we remember is that many of their arguments revolve around self-creating universes, deep time, those billions of years, as well as evolutionary theory. So things that are predicated on statistical improbabilities. Now, one of the things that they will say then is that the universe is disorderly, there is no intention, there is no pattern to its creation. And that's directly contradicted by the fact that our universe is extremely orderly. When we look at the rotation of the planets, we see that they are not perfect ellipses. They're a little wonky. And that's because if they weren't a little wonky, our planets would crash into each other. So that seems orderly. We also have things like our laws of physics, so especially your laws of thermodynamics, the creation of matter, or matter can neither be created nor destroyed, but rather it changes. We have our law of entropy, that the universe is orderly, even though it is slowly spiraling down into chaos. Math. Things like calculus and algebra and trigonometry represent an orderly universe. The fact that you can take numbers, even if they're imaginary numbers, and come out with calculations that are always correct, demonstrates that there are pure, unadulterated natural laws and patterns. And that is how we can get people into space, is because physicists, astronomers understand how these patterns work and can manipulate them. One of the best representations is the periodic table of elements. So in times before, as they are developing that periodic table, researchers were able to predict where elements were going to fall before those elements were discovered. They knew they existed because there was a pattern. And again, what this is demonstrating to us is a nature that has pattern, has order, has design, and therefore we would argue has intention. My personal favorite are biological systems. Because one of the things that we see is the intricacies of the biological system, and this begins to get us into that conflict then with evolutionary theory. And so, one, we have tried to mimic biological systems as long as humans have existed. What is a telescope except a mechanical eye? What are computers except mechanical brains? What are airplanes except mechanical wings? But one of the things that we as humans understand about our machines, our attempt to recreate the intricacies of biology, is that we can't. Planes are going to crash, computers need updates, your telescope is going to fail. So we understand that it's too intricate for us to perfect. The other thing is that biological systems are too expensive. So we look at life, and life, according to evolutionary theory, is based on the premise that survival of the fittest is all that matters. And so what we should see in the universe is that in order to survive, organisms should move from complex to simple. We should be stripping away anything that does not directly aid survival and the propagation of our genes. Instead, what science has discovered is that the Earth is teeming with living things, with organisms that occupy very carefully balanced niches. And these interdependencies are not random. They are not part of a pattern. They're not chaotic because you take away an organism or you add an organism to an ecosystem and it's going to crash. So anyone that is struggling to keep one particular odd little minnow alive in a stream understands what that little guy's role is in the balance of that biological ecosystem. Because if he goes, who knows what's going to happen? One of the greatest examples of a biological system that is far too expensive to exist is going to be humanity. Because when we look at the human species, pretty much everything about us is superfluous. Right? We look at our free will, we look at emotions, we look at all of the trappings of civilization we have around us. And all of that is extraordinarily ill-adapted for survival when we compare ourselves to the virus and the virus's ability to propagate itself and survive. And so this is, again, why we argue that creation is not only controlled and organized, but it's also supervised by an intelligent designer. And so we, again, say that the cosmos was deliberately created to declare itself a designed pattern that continually mocks our efforts to mimic. There we go. All right. Look at that little guy. So before we close this section on illustrations of a creator's presence in the natural world, we do want to talk about our points of contention. And the first up in that docket is going to be the age of the Earth and the universe. And the reason that this is a particularly controversial idea is because for many of us, this has to be mutually exclusive. So either you can have God or you can have scientific theories, but you can't have both. So looking at the age of the Earth and the universe, one of the things from a naturalist perspective then is that deep time is necessary for the Earth to be the way it is, for the universe to be the way it is. And right now, NASA is calculating that at about 13.77 billion years. Check their website every once in a while because sometimes it changes, but it always goes up. The Christian community, in contrast, is largely divided on the age of the Earth and the universe. And I want to talk about that briefly to help you decide where you stand on the matter. And that, again, will help you reflect then how to share that view with a skeptic. And we're going to start with the most conservative and move to the most liberal. And that conservative then is going to be our young Earth creationism. So with young Earth creationism, we're going to kind of split this into two. But the most conservative of this view is that due to the inerrancy of the Bible, all numbers, all genealogies are literal. And that means that you can calculate the age of the Earth, particularly using numbers between Genesis 5 and Genesis 12, to come up with an Earth that is around 6,026 years old. A more liberal variation of this view stretches that number to potentially tens of thousands, and that's usually coming from Christian scientists who are performing their own experiments or reviewing secular research. Now, the next step is going to be old Earth creationism. And so old Earth creationism is when we are beginning to try to meld scientific theory and what we currently understand about geological age in with our theology. And so this proposes that God created the framework of the universe. He maybe set off the Big Bang. He may have begun the evolutionary process. But there are three primary views even with this one, and we're not going to define them right now, but we talk about the day-age theory. We talk about the gap theory, so that millions of years between every day of creation. And we also talk about progressive creation. And that's where God created the universe in, we would call them blasts. So every geological age then being a creation event. Last step is we don't know. So some Christians then have determined that the age of the Earth, the age of the universe, within the current limits of science and biblical revelation is unknowable. And if it is unknowable, if God has not given that data to us, then it's not integral to faith. Regardless of where you fall on those views, again, I do want to caution us from intertwining our theology with scientific theory. Because the minute that particular theory is debunked, we have to scramble to come up with a reason why a pillar of our faith has just collapsed. The other one we talk about is evolution and Darwinism. And this is where we get to my little friend here. So the theories of evolution and the age of the universe are really closely intertwined. And that is because they are used to prove each other true. So we call this circular reasoning as a logical fallacy. But in order for macroevolution to be true, it requires statistically deep time to make it work. But the reason that we prove deep time is possible is because look at macroevolution and how it's worked over all this time as we start talking ourselves into circles. But what Darwin and what others did observe is that microevolution is an established scientific fact. So little things survive to reproduce, propagate their genes, fit into their little niches. So we talk about things like finches and their beak leaf and things like that. But they take this then and leap then to macroevolution. And that is that if something can survive to the fittest, then eventually it could form new anatomical structures and genetic codes. The problem is there is no observed evidence or experiment that indicates natural selection can lead to that level of genetic mutation and the formation of new species. Now, the counter to this is an observed natural phenomenon that we call instant speciation. And instant speciation then is a form of mutation in which we would call polyploidy. And that's during the meiosis process, extra copies of chromosomes are created. Now, we do see that in humans on some level, but in the headlines, it was declared that two individuals of the species Hylochrysoskeleus, the tree frog, gray tree frog, sometimes called Cope's tree frog, at some point must have experienced a gene mutation that resulted in the duplication of this animal's chromosomes. And these mutated frogs then mated with a non-mutated individual, and this led to the new species, Hyla versicolor. The only physical way to distinguish these two little guys is by the male's mating call. He sounds funny. Females of the new species are able and willing to mate with everybody, with both sides. But when they mate with the versicolor male, the hybrid that they create usually doesn't happen. It is very rare for them to be able to produce viable offspring. And when one does survive, it's male. And the problem is that none of the girls want this poor little boy. Because while his mom or dad's mating call was funny, his doesn't make any sense to anybody. So this poor little guy is sitting there in the stream just babbling his head off, and no one can understand a word he's saying. So what we begin to see, one, is that researchers then took this scenario and they hypothesized then that these spare genes could be utilized by the creative processes of evolution to begin growing new anatomical structures. One of the problems is that, one, these two foundational individuals that at some point experienced polyploidy are hypothetical. We don't actually know where they came from, when they came from. They just think that they did. The other problem is that the researchers and the popular journalists gloss over the fact that this mutation is well known. It's well documented. It's in plants, it's in amphibians and insects, because this is the process which allows some species, some animals to reproduce asexually. So things like budding or growing new corms on your bulb. So what they don't explain is how this process was carried out in the past through macroevolution, and how it's going to be carried out in the future, how they are going to grow new anatomical structures off of these chromosomes. What we do know is that these mutations are almost always what we would call deleterious. And that means that the embryo dies in development because of these mutations. When you do have a viable offspring born with these mutations, as we see with these hybrid frogs, is they are either selected against by nature, so evolution doesn't like them, or they're sterile. So we think about like a mule. You can't get baby mules from a mule, not usually. And so what's even more telling is that very recent studies, and I think this is pretty cool, show that when we see this in plants, what botanists have discovered is that these mutations happen in very specific places within a plant's genome. And those are places that the plant knows that those mutations can't hurt it. And so what we are beginning to see is that researchers can predict where a mutation will happen. So it's not random and it's not unsupervised. Mutations we are finding are following patterns. And that's why we talk about our little froggy friend. So then we ask, what next? So, if there is a divine presence, if there is an intelligent designer, who is it? We are going to argue that we know who it is because that intelligent designer, that entity, left us a text to tell us who he is and what he wants of us. And so what we have to establish then is that text true? And to understand that, we have to ask, does it contradict external facts? Does it fit within the context it claims? And does it have an internal logic to it? Or does it contradict itself? Now we go to archaeology. And so archaeology then is going to be the study of humanity's past through material culture. And material culture then, this is the object or the landscapes or the animals that humanity has altered. So again, when we're talking about archaeology, just like with science, we can't use it to quantitatively prove the Bible is true. And that is because there are thousands of years of biblical history that are not accounted for in the archaeological record. That's okay. When we are looking for things that corroborate the biblical story, we're going to particularly be looking for texts that mention people and places and events. And the earliest known current artifact that directly corroborates a particular person, event, in the biblical narrative is going to be Pharaoh Shishonk or Pharaoh Shishak's invasion in 925 BC. So thousands of years of biblical history is missing right there. And that's okay. So archaeology isn't useless, because what archaeology does is it allows us to provide geographical, cultural, chronological anchors for the biblical context. It also very beautifully illustrates the material culture of the biblical world. So we can understand more about the Israelites, more about the surrounding nations. And it helps us visualize and understand the narratives better. Start reading it in 3D. And so some of the artifacts that we're going to talk about are very few, just because of time constraints. In the book, there are several more that I mentioned, and even that is just scratching the surface of biblically related artifacts. But we are going to start with the Maranatha Stela. And the Maranatha Stela then is going to be, this is not the earliest chronological marker of people, places, events, but this is the earliest, and I would say accepted, inscription that references Israel as a tribal nation. And so this is in honor of Pharaoh and Maranatha of Egypt. It dates to 1208 BC. And this stela then, when I say stela, I mean a monumental inscription or a standing stone, a pillar. It is talking about his conquest, particularly up the Mediterranean coast towards Haiti. And in these conquests, then, he's talking about different people and people groups and tribes that he's defeated in this campaign. And so some of the things that he talks about, he says, Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. And so this is just a really nice close-up then of that portion of the inscription that says Israel which I have zero knowledge of hieroglyphs. So it's there somewhere. But what this is telling us is that by 1208 BC, Israel as a tribal nation was present in the land of Canaan. The next up, and the reason that this is important, so this is the Tel Dan inscription. So this comes up north of Galilee from the side of Dan. This is important because one of the things that we see oftentimes in research and in popular writings is this controversy of the Bible says this person existed, but they're not in archaeology, so obviously they can't exist and the Bible's made up. So some people said that about the United Monarchy. They said Saul couldn't have existed, David didn't exist, Solomon didn't exist, because we don't have any text talking about these people. Here we go. So the Tel Dan inscription is dated to around 870 to 750 BC. And we understand that is well past David's lifetime, somewhere between 60 and 200 years after David's death, and that's okay, because George Washington lived 200 years ago. We know who George Washington was. If we knew our great-great-great-grandparents and on down the line, we begin coming in closer and closer contact with people who were witnesses of this individual. And so, even if it were written 200 years after David's death, there's still that living memory of his existence, of his rule. And so the Tel Dan inscription just mentions then that the ruler at this time, and we're not entirely sure who he was that wrote this, but he talks about the house of David, and that's highlighted right there. And so acknowledging then that David was a historical figure at the time of this inscription, he was recognized internationally as a historical figure. And there's just that part of the inscription, I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. It also mentions Ahab, so this is a really cool inscription. Right. By the time we get to the New Testament, by that point in time, there have been enough conquests, there has been enough interaction between the kingdom of Judah and the Jews and the rest of the Western empires that we begin to see so much documentation of these people, these places, that there's not a whole lot of question about New Testament events. Most scholars acknowledge that Jesus existed. They may not believe he was the Son of God, but we have enough historical references to him to at least be pretty certain that he was here, even if you were a skeptic. But what archaeology does then is just kind of tie in some of those individuals from the New Testament into our view, and one of those is the Pilate inscription. So this dates between 26 and 36 AD, and it simply mentions that Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judah, there we go, had dedicated a Tiberium or a temple to Tiberius and his deified parents, the Augustes. But again, this gives us a nice illustration. Who was Pilate? He was someone powerful enough to have built a temple to Tiberius. Also means that he was also really trying to kiss up to the Roman rulers at this time because nobody liked Pilate. But that's another thing. Now this is a fun one. So this is popularly called the Caiaphas ossuary. When we talk about an ossuary, we're talking about what we would call bone box. And this is because Second Temple Jewish burial traditions meant that you took the body, you laid it out in a stone-cut tomb for 1 year. At the end of the year, the family comes in, they clean the bones, and then they lay them in an ossuary, a bone box. And usually they inscribe then the interred's name on that side of the box. And so this one was discovered. It was inscribed with Joseph, son of Caiaphas, which was the title of Caiaphas, the high priest, during the crucifixion event. And inside, researchers found the bones of a male aged around 60 years. Because of just the pure opulence of this box, look at the geometric perfection of this carving. Someone spent a lot of time and a lot of money. Because of its opulence, because of the name, because of the date, because of the bones found inside, we can reasonably and relatively safely infer then that this is the Caiaphas reference then in the crucifixion account. So let's get to text and context. And this is really my favorite way to use archaeology then in our discussion. And that's because when we're talking about the Near East, we are talking about cultures that developed writing around 3000 BC. So we have old texts. And a lot of those texts are economic, so we get people's receipts. But a lot of those texts are rituals, or they're histories, or they're law codes and myths. And so because of that, then we can begin talking about comparative mythologies, comparative law codes. And that could be a really useful direction to take dialogue. Because oftentimes skeptics are going to use what we would call the B word. And that B word is borrowed. So oftentimes, especially if you are reading an article, somebody is talking about the Bible borrowed from Hammurabi's code, or the Bible borrowed from the Sumerian flood myth. So what we argue then is that when we compare mythologies, when we compare law codes, we see, understandably, that the Bible is situated in a common cultural and temporal context as these law codes, as these mythologies, as it should be, as we would expect it as believers. But it also demonstrates that our God is wholly unlike other gods. The culture that God expected of his people is wholly different from that of the rest of the ancient world. And that is because God was trying to bring people back into his presence. God wasn't creating laws to perpetuate the injustices that he saw in his fallen creation. There are a lot of examples, but the one we're going to look at briefly is what we would call lex talionis law, or the law of response in kind, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So there are a bunch of these, but the one we're going to focus on is going to be Exodus 21, 22 through 25. And that says that if two men struggle with each other and they strike a woman with child and she gives birth prematurely, but no fatal injury follows, that's important, the man who struck her will be fined according to the penalty the husband of the woman lays upon him, and he will give according to the estimate. Yet if a fatal injury follows, then he will certainly give life for life. And that's important because the Hebrews understood this to mean that if fatal injury followed the mother, life for life. If fatal injury followed the child, it was life for life. And we'll see later on, rabbis will say, okay, well, if she were struck in the 10th month, which means that the child could still survive, life for life. But if it's the 5th, and they get to quibbling. But the Hebrews understood that to be straightforward. If that baby dies, that man has just forfeited his life. These are three contemporary law codes. We have Hammurabi's code, Middle Assyrian, and the Hittites. I'm not going to just read these fully, but one of the things we see Hammurabi's code, if a man has struck a free woman, a woman of the upper class, and has caused her to miscarry, he shall pay 10 shekels for her miscarriage. If the woman dies, his daughter will be put to death. Middle Assyrian code, if it's the daughter of a free man, he's going to be fined, he's going to get public beating, and then he's going to do a bit of hard labor. And that's all cool. And again, the Hittites then, whoever dies, let's just pay a fine, call it done. And so what we see then is that this gives us a good overview of the cognitive environment, the way people thought in the ancient world. And we see helpfully then that most of these ancient cultures understood that if you hit a pregnant woman hard enough to make her miscarry, that's bad. But what we see with these extra biblical laws is that this is a crime that a fine can make right. You just cross somebody's palms with silver and we're all going to be cool again. Unless, of course, you're an upper class girl in old Babylon, and then if daddy hits a girl hard enough to make her miscarry, guess who's got to pay for that? So, extra biblical law, fines can make this right no matter who dies. In God's law, God viewed the loss of both a woman as well as a child as a true crime, a crime that required lex talionis. And so we see that God not only recognized the value of all lives, but God did not distinguish between a pregnant slave and a pregnant noble woman. It didn't matter your social status, life for life. Whereas here, if you were a slave, you got like pennies on the dollar for your fine. So it was okay to be a slave. And so again, what we are seeing here and what we are arguing is, again, our God, God's laws, are wholly unlike the world around him. And therefore we argue they are divinely inspired, but also with the intent of bringing us back to God. Let's see, how am I doing on my time? Can't see the clock. All right, but we'll pop on through our archaeology, talking about our points of contention. So this is my wheelhouse, the Abraham's camels question. Now, you oftentimes then hear people say, well, the Bible then is a mythological event, and we can tell that because camels were documented through carbon-14 dating as being domesticated in the Middle East around the 10th century, around the 900s BC. So when the Bible says that Abraham had camels, well, obviously it's made up. What this argument demonstrates is a very understandable but fundamental misunderstanding of the domestication process. And that is, especially with animals with species like horses, like camels, you are looking at hundreds of years and hundreds of generations of these animals in order to produce what we would consider a true domesticate. And that is going to be an individual whose DNA demonstrates that it is different from a wild type. The problem with that is that finding DNA in any kind of bones, even in the ancient Near East, is extremely difficult. But zooarchaeologists at this point estimate that camels actually began to be domesticated around 3000 BC. So what we would expect of a terribly wealthy and powerful tribal sheikh like Abraham is that he would have a herd of half-domesticated camels. This would kind of be the equivalent of a powerful figure today having a garage full of Lamborghinis. It's a show of wealth, and that's cool. All right, we want to talk briefly about laws of genocide. So things like the Jericho event, kill every living creature, kill all men, women, and children. This is a tripping point for many skeptics. Sometimes it turns Christians into skeptics because we very reasonably ask, how could a loving God demand that women and children, the innocents, be killed? So there are many possibilities to this. One, you can argue that God is a righteous judge, and this is similar to other lethal judgment events like Court Dathan and Abiram, Achan's family, the flood. Other scholars are going to point out that when we look at other ancient texts that describe conquest, and remember that much of the Mosaic books are conquest events, they are going to point out that the conquest tale, the conquest command, is also a literary genre. And so its readers would understand that annihilation language, kill all living things, kill all women and children and animals, could be a symbolic discussion. That discussion, that symbolism of utter annihilation. Because when we see comparable texts like the Mesha Stela, like the Sennacherib Prism, like the Maranepta Stela, they utterly annihilated this city. But then here's the number of women slaves that we took, here's the number of children, here are all the animals, here's all the booty that we took. One way that biblical scholars believe that that language then in the Bible is also following that genre is that in Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14, we have that discussion where God describes what to do with a slave girl that you have taken, even though they were all supposed to be utterly annihilated. So just some thoughts there. And that harem language, again, that's that conquest language as a literary genre. 21. And finally, we do want to address the archaeology of miracles, because many Christians, many skeptics would dearly love to find physical evidence of a miracle in the archaeological record, in the geological record. So we talk about things like Joshua's longest day, or we talk about the parting of the Red Sea or the Jordan. And the problem is that if we turn to the archaeological record to look for a miracle, all we are going to find are perfectly explicable natural phenomena. So things that look like an earthquake, or the fact that the parting of the seas did not actually divert the waters long enough to create a geological change in the landscape. Jericho looks like an earthquake hit it and then it was set on fire. So we want to be careful trying to find miracles in the archaeological record. If you have time, we do talk about the incident of Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem and how we do have some contemporary descriptions of that siege and its oddly abrupt ending, but we also have historians then that backtrack and say, okay, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. So again, even if we had a text, people are going to try to explain that away. All right, and that's just the inscription that's on the Sennacherib prism. We'll pop past that because I want to finish up before our time is completely gone. But one thing to very quickly look at is the internal elegance and inerrancy of the Bible. So skeptics claim that there are around 50,000 errors in the Bible. You may also see the number 200,000 or 400,000. That 50,000 is errors and contradictions that they believe that they find, plot holes, inconsistencies. The 200,000 to 400,000 is what we would call typos. And that's where a scribe accidentally put a jot or a tittle in the wrong place, or they juxtaposed a couple of words. If you ever get a chance to look up the printer's Bible, that is always a fun one. So that's our skeptics' claim. Now, let's go back and think about the Sadducees error. The Sadducees had contempt of the doctrine that they were trying to argue. And what we often see, and this is the page for the American Atheist, where they're listing some of those 50,000 errors, is complete misunderstandings of genre, of history, of language, of the difference between the Old and the New Testament. Because you have things like Ecclesiastes, wisdom literature, which said the earth abideth forever, whereas, follow this contradiction in 2 Peter, which says the elements will melt with a fervent heat, and the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Or we could talk about the difference between an epistle in the New Testament versus wisdom literature. And so that's what Christians claim then, that the text is inerrant. And by inerrant, we mean that it contains no internal or external contradictions. And we understand then that the text is situated in the ancient world. We understand differences between the testaments, and we understand the differences between literary genres. So again, going back to wisdom literature, what do our own proverbialisms today say? Well, it says that a stitch in time saves 9. It also says he who hesitates is lost. So we even find that among our own proverbialisms, if we took them literally, then they contradict each other. If we understand that they're contextually based, then they're all kind of true. All right. So we're going to close with a very quick discussion of philosophies. And so this gets to the crux of the issue, and that is that we cannot quantitatively prove the existence of God. There is no scientific measure for his existence. We, however, cannot prove that God does not exist because there is no scientific measure. And so what this brings to the skeptic as well as the Christian too is the common ground that our argument is ultimately philosophical. Who has the most logical explanation? And one of the logics then that we use is, what does the world look like with God and without God? And as Karl Marx very aptly stated, one of these is going to be the opiate of the masses, the distraction that takes us away and removes our responsibilities, our anxieties. Marx argued that it was religion, that religion keeps the people down. However, when we look at atheism, agnosticism, naturalism, materialism, nihilism, these are the opiates because they calm these anxieties of moral responsibility and fear of punishment and life after death by reducing the human experience to a very selfish, very fleeting speck in our universe. In contrast, we have Christianity, and Christianity provides a hope, it provides a reason to live selflessly, to love, to have mercy. Has Christianity been used as an excuse for evil? Yeah, we have the Crusades, those were pretty terrible. But has atheism? And we look at the world of atheism and we see African slavery, we see eugenics, we see the Holocaust. Each of these events were predicated on this idea that humans are just another evolved species. And what is our responsibility as the strongest species? It's to wipe out the weaker. And so that's why we argue then that we need God. And another point of the philosophies is the idea of consciousness and free will. And so some skeptics are going to claim that these thoughts, these arguments that I'm standing here making, this is all a user illusion. And that's a computer science term because Daniel Dennett, the main proponent of this view, brings in the idea that everything that we believe is free will, everything we believe to be consciousness, is just our poor little brain's way of disguising the biological processes that evolution demands that we follow. And so what this means then is that everything, the concept of self, our passions, our fantasies, all of these are just chemical responses to our biological needs, our need for survival, for propagation. So there is no sense of self, and Susan Blackmore then states it as this so-called me is just another reconstruction. There was an earlier one 30 minutes ago, and there will be others in the future, but they're really not the same person. They're just stuff happening in the universe. So there's no self to die, and there's certainly no self to continue after death. I'm smiling because it's so beautiful when you get it. You can let go and just accept that it's just the universe doing its stuff. It's not me against the world, because there really isn't any me at all. Death has no sting because there is never a you to die. So this idea then that I'm not responsible for anything I do because I'm just seeing the browser going and everything else important is going on in the background. I don't need to know about it. This is in contrast then, one, to Paul's statement that for man he made all nations, and the concept then that we are groping, we are seeking God. And that's important because we find ourselves really in a philosophical catch-22. Because would an anthropomorphized robot believe that it was a robot, or does it know? If I don't believe I'm a robot, if I believe that I'm a human being with wants and passions and beliefs, could I actually be a robot? And so René Descartes very aptly states, I doubt, therefore I am, or what is the same, I think, therefore I am. And C.S. Lewis beautifully rephrases that as the idea, as he says, I can't trust the argument leading to atheism because if that's not my own thinking, I can't use thought. But he says, I cannot believe in thought, so I never use thought to disbelieve in God. All right. So what we close with then is what's called Pascal's wager. And Pascal's wager then is the question of if God does not exist, then what? And so what we understand is if God does not exist and the Bible is not true, then what? That means that there are no moral, objective standards by which to live. If there are no morals, only ethics, who defines those? And what we would say then is each society or cultural group is responsible for determining and maintaining their own ethical codes, and no one outside that group has the right to criticize because the majority rules. If we are basing our behaviors then on what is currently socially acceptable, where does that lead society? You could ask Nazi Germany where it leads society. What happens if individuals don't care what society thinks? And then we have Jeffrey Dahmer offering his insight that if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within socially acceptable ranges? And finally, if God does not exist and the Bible is not true, then what? If you choose to believe God exists, you accept the responsibility for following his will. If you're wrong, why be lost? You'll never know. You'll just die and the light goes out. If you choose not to believe God exists, according to Pascal's wager, then you have accepted the consequences of being wrong. And so, as we conclude then, we can't expect a skeptic to just trust me. We can't expect a skeptic to just trust the Bible. And so we set up that foundation. And so as we set up that foundation, then we can't stop there. So as you leave this room, go out and read more. Look at articles, read things that you completely disagree with, and ask yourself why you disagree with those things. Ask yourself, how would I argue with the author of this text? Why they're wrong? or why my view is correct. And keep experimenting, keep thinking of those dialogues. And recall again Christ's command that I am sending you out as sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. I think that concludes. I think I probably went monstrously over time, which I apologize for. If someone has any questions, please do contact me, or I don't have much to do after this, so if you want to discuss things with me, I would love to do that. And I thank you very much for giving me your time and attention today.